Good morning. Just getting everything up and running for my presentation, Procuring the Dead Sleeps, Creating and Working with the Witches Flying Ointment. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's going to just take a couple minutes and get everybody admitted into the waiting room. We've got about 1 more minute until everything starts up. Screen share. So this is a topic that I've been teaching about since 2016. It's always something that I've been really interested in because it incorporates, both the medicinal and scientific as well as the magical and spiritual side of working with plants that are part of the poison path, specifically plants in the nightshade family, as well as other poisonous medicinal herbs, things like opium poppy, wolfsbane or aconite, poison hemlock. The nightshades are kind of the main players in the witch's flying ointment, with the exception of datura, while it does have a lot of the same chemistry as other European nightshades or nightshades in general. It did come along a little bit later, so there are a few recipes that datura pops up in, but we'll see a lot of the same kind of plants sort of repeating themselves as far as the surviving recipes from the medieval and pre-modern period. While it was a little bit of a latecomer, datura, um, it does have a lot of the same medicinal uses as other plants in the nightshade family, of course, as well as a lot of the entheogenic or psychoactive qualities that we attribute to plants in this family. Happy to answer anybody's questions if you want to put them in the chat, or if there's anything that we don't get to cover, or if you think of something after the fact, or if you're watching this in the future, feel free to send me an email at thepoisonersapothecary@gmail.com. Just killing some time as we get a few more people to trickle in. This presentation is being recorded, so it will be available to everyone um, after we get finished today. So I'm assuming a lot of people are going to catch the recording later. So the access to this did get shared on Patreon. So with all of the kind of more technical and scientific information that we're going to cover, I'm going to go over some of the history and kind of how the witch's flying ointment came to be, what it is, and what people thought about it and were saying about it during the Middle Ages, during the time period that this idea of the archetypal kind of medieval witch idea really started to take form. So there's a lot of different elements that kind of feed into this. So the flying ointment is very much a kind of container and symbol for all of these early ideas. A lot of it coming from the classical period, antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome, as well as a little bit later European folk beliefs and different things like that that all kind of swirled together and formed this idea of the witch's flying ointment, and then became attached to all of these other concepts, kind of floating around that then got wrapped up into the witch hunts and the Inquisition and all of that. They really start to kind of emerge and rise up after the period of the Black Death. So there was a lot of paranoia during that time, as well, as far as like this sort of secretive underworld of people that were essentially spreading the plague. Um, and so a lot of that kind of transfers into the early years of the witch craze and just sort of the general paranoia. And we see the witch's ointment becoming, a representative of all of that and all of those ideas. Because there is a lot of connection between poison and plague and contagion and different things like that. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for being here and watching the live. Thank you to everybody watching in the future. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. So before this idea of the witch's ointment really became a thing, these botanical preparations and medicinal formulas were widely used throughout the ancient and early modern periods as medicinal salves. But we also have this earlier idea of the magical salve that rises up in ancient Greece. We see salves for transformation, salves for literal flying in some of the mythology, and kind of connected to this idea of the pharmacon, or these medicinal, magical, and poisonous preparations that we see connected to the mythology of Hecate, Circe, Medea, and all of these really early archetypal pharmacos figures. So people that were knowledgeable about these poisonous and psychoactive plants. So they were used for a variety of magical purposes. And that is one thing that I try and kind of stress when I do these presentations is that, the spirit flight aspect, traveling to the witch's Sabbath is, a very important part of the early mythology and kind of idea of what a flying ointment actually is. That's why they're called flying ointments. But this can be used as a magical formula for a lot of different intentions, aside from, spirit flight just for the sake of spirit flight. So there's a lot of other magical correspondences and spiritual influences kind of wrapped up in what these ointments are and what they're actually capable of doing. We'll cover a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So they were initially magical salves that could be used for a variety of different purposes. There were also flying ointments before they were witches' ointments. So the idea of magical salves containing potent plants being applied to the body for flight was an earlier idea that already existed. Some of the recipes and some of the ointments didn't necessarily even contain poisonous or psychoactive plants or entheogens. They were just these magical preparations that people were using for flying to different places. Whether the accounts of that were literal flight or more of a spiritual astral flight. The main focus and use behind those was for flying. And then later in the 15th century, we start to see the connection to witches begin to come in. We see things like, cursing, killing people's cattle, night riding, or this idea of the night hag or nocturnal spirit visiting their victims and draining their energy and different things like that. So we start to see kind of some of more of these nefarious and sinister uses and associations once the witch craze really begins to kick up. So one of the earliest accounts of a flying ointment is in the book of Sacred Magic of Abramel and the Mage by Abraham of Worms, who lived from 1362 to 1458. This recounts him being given an ointment by an old woman that gives him the ability to fly. So again, there's not really any association to witches or witchcraft. This is just a sort of folk medicine preparation that one of the old village people had. A lot of these are kind of tied back to these obscure sources of, folk herbalists and wise women that gave these people the ointment, or the ointment just sort of, appeared in some way. There's not a lot of background as to the origin of where they actually came from. Then when we start to move more into the medieval period and early modern period, when the witch craze really starts to kick up, we see a lot more of these sort of diabolical associations with these ointments, which is connected to the idea of the heretic's ointment. So the heretic's ointment, again, it wasn't something that actually contained poisonous or psychoactive plants. It was this idea of unbaptized children and their fat being used to create these very transgressive formulas that people were rubbing on themselves in kind of a transgressive ritual. So this would have been connected to ideas of blood drinking, cannibalism, murder, infanticide, all of these different pieces of propaganda that would have been used by the church to kind of demonize different groups of people. So it originally started out as one of the accusations that we see for some of the early Christian sects that didn't belong to the Catholic Church. So flying ointments in the Middle Ages. So healing salves were very commonplace during this time period. So knowledge of their use and their existence would have been very widespread. This would have been a really common medicinal preparation that, the majority of people would have access to, or there would at least be one or multiple people in the town or in the village that had knowledge to prepare these ointments and use them and kind of dispense them to people as needed as a type of medical treatment. So it was something that had practical uses and really existed in, just early folk medicine and pre-modern medicine in the form of, surgeons, salves, pain relieving ointments, and different things like that. So it would have been really convenient evidence during the witch craze for people to find these ointments and then say that it was this heretic's ointment or witch's salve that people were using to enter into these altered states of consciousness, or fly in spirit through aid of the devil, to go to the witch's sabbath. Psychoactive effects were attributed to the devil by church inquisitors. So really on initially, when this started to kind of come up in conversation, the church originally said that like flying ointments were just a bunch of nonsense. They weren't actually doing anything, and kind of just chucked the idea out altogether. But then this sort of conversation and understanding of the psychoactive effects of the drugs or plants that were included in those ointments or early medicinal formulations, that through extracting these accounts through torture, that people, actually believed that these things were happening or that they were actually happening. So they had to kind of revisit it and represent the idea and said that it was still diabolical, but it was a drug-induced delusion. So these people were basically delusional, they were high on drugs, and that was opening them up to the devil being able to come in and convince them that they were going to these places and doing these things. So we have two kind of main sides to the argument. One being that it was diabolical witchcraft, whether that was attributed, solely to the power of the devil by himself, or working through the means of these poisonous and psychoactive plants to kind of draw people into his cult and his worship. And then the other side of it that was arguing kind of against the church inquisitors, saying that the devil really doesn't have anything to do with it, that it is all due to these psychoactive plants that are making people think that these things are happening, but they're not actually happening. So essentially, they're innocent of the accusations that are being thrown at them. So a lot of the surviving writing on this topic from this period comes from both sides of this argument. Prior to ideas of the witches' ointment, which came a little bit later, like I said, after the period of the Black Plague, we start to see it kind of pop up a little bit more in the 14th and 15th century, and then really kick up and get going, moving later down the line into the early modern period. But there were medicinal preparations that contained many of the ingredients that were said to be included in these later ointments that were used medicinally. One of them is the unguentum populion. So this is a poplar ointment that comes out of 11th, 12th century Italy. It was a recipe that consisted of henbane, red poppy, mandrake, and deadly nightshade. So popular ingredients for the unguentum populion mainly included plants from the Solanaceae family or nightshade family, as well as opium poppy. So they would have been used as sort of an early form of anesthetic. They would have had pain relieving effects, but they would have also been formulated in a way that would have allowed them to put people into kind of a sleep for minor surgeries that would be performed. So this is also known as the surgeon's salve, and different things like this were used since ancient Roman times. The soporific sponge, which is also another early form of anesthetic that was used to induce this state that was called twilight sleep. It was essentially a sponge that was soaked in things like mandrake, or wine infused with mandrake, hemlock, cannabis, opium poppy, different soporific or sleep-inducing plants, as well as plants that had a pain-relieving or analgesic effect. So this would have been held under the patient's nose, and it would have kind of lulled them into a really deep sleep that would allow for surgeons to perform whatever operations they were doing. It was also said that during the ancient Roman period that women would go around out of sympathy to people that were being crucified and give them these soporific sponges or sleep-inducing preparations to kind of knock them out and ease their pain. It was even said that when Jesus Christ was crucified, that one of these was given to him and that he didn't actually die, but that he was sort of in this drug-induced stupor for 3 days, which allowed him to sort of survive the crucifixion and then go on and do whatever it was that he did in secret after that. So all of the medieval flying ointment recipes are based on similar sources, and when we kind of look at them chronologically, we start to see these patterns repeating themselves, which I think is something important to pay attention to. So with the exception of like bat's blood and the fat of unbaptized children, people were basing this on some kind of fact, that these plants were capable of causing these kinds of states. Let's see, we had something pop up. How would they pull the surgery patient back? I think it was something more or less that would just eventually wear off. I don't know if they used some kind of like smelling salt or vinegar or something that would have woken them up just because of its intense odor or smell. But I don't think that there was necessarily like an antidote to bring them back or wake them up. But that's a really good question. I'll have to look deeper into that and see if there is something to that. So the first recipe that we have is by Girolamo Cardano, which is interesting because in addition to giving the recipe, um, he also gives some of the different content that can be experienced when dreaming under the influence of some of these ointments. So this was around the middle of the 16th century, where he says it is the fat of children, the juice of parsley, aconite, nightshade, referring to deadly nightshade, cinquefoil, and soot. He mentions the experience of theaters, pleasure gardens, banquets, beautiful ornaments and clothing, handsome young men, kings, magistrates. So all of these really kind of lavish and desirable things. And then it shifts over to demons, ravens, prisoners, desert wastes, and torments. So this kind of shows both the aphrodisiac and pleasurable side of nightshade intoxication, and then that it can quickly turn into something more sinister and uncomfortable. And a lot of this is dependent on dosage. So the way that these would have been applied, initially they would have been more relaxant, sedative, intoxicating, aphrodisiac, and then as the body absorbed more of the alkaloids from the plants, it could have gone into a more sort of manic, delusional state where the visions, dreams, or hallucinations kind of become more sinister. No, the fat of children, we have a question in the chat. The fat of children was not actually used. So this is something that comes out of the idea of the heretics ointment. So a lot of this is kind of early medicine. So having a very like concrete, practical side to it. Like people were actually using these things as medicinal preparations for a very long time. But then it also kind of gets wrapped up in this sort of medieval superstition and Christian propaganda. So the heretics ointment, sort of this earlier idea um, of heretics or people that were Christian, but not the right kind of Christian, according to the church, were doing, or not actually doing, but accused of doing all of these really diabolical and transgressive things, from cannibalism to drinking blood to sodomy, to all of these things that were considered very, very taboo. So a lot of the ideas surrounding medieval witchcraft are kind of drawn from this earlier concept of heresy. And then we start to see the folk medicine, the plant medicine all kind of get wrapped up into that too. So it's very much a matter of kind of separating the fact from the fiction and what was just being used by inquisitors to help support their accusations versus, what was actually chemically possible of causing these states of consciousness that people were experiencing. And so the kind of the repetition of the ingredients from all of these different sources shows us that there is a very kind of practical phytochemical perspective at people's knowledge around the psychoactive effects or poisonous potential of these medicinal preparations. So Cardano is the first kind of earliest connection between witches and ointments. Um, so before it was more so heretics ointment and kind of this symbol of anti-Christian underground sects that were trying to undermine what the church was doing. And then we really start to see the connection between witches come in. And I think that this also maybe has to do with sort of early modern medicine really starting to kind of take hold in the years after the plague. So we really start to see kind of more of a demonization of natural medicine, folk medicine, and then that also being connected to women and other, kind of marginalized or outside members of society. So these would have been like the folk herbalists, all of these people that were essentially a threat to the um, educated class of, church funded and sanctioned physicians. Another question, do we know if Dante used any salves or teas that would have led up to inspired his writing of Inferno? That's a really good question too. I don't actually know if he was under the influence of anything, but I mean, there's a lot of connection and similarity to, things that are experienced under the influence of flying ointment. When it comes to underworld travel and some of the visionary qualities, that there's, a possibility. And then, there is the idea too that a lot of these plants, like people knew that they were poisonous, knew that they were psychoactive. They were being commonly used in medicine. So it would have also been kind of common knowledge that they could have been used recreationally as well. Especially things like henbane, mandrake, been used as aphrodisiac formulas for hundreds and hundreds of years. People would have just been taking them in some cases to have a good time. So again, that kind of goes into the commonality of people just knowing that these things existed and what they were capable of. So it would have kind of been like, somebody's medicine cabinet at home having like Tylenol or aspirin. A lot of these people would have had them in their own personal, medicine cabinets back then. Andre Laguna in 1545 gives us the most reliable record of testing a soporific ointment on a patient. So again, he's connecting it to the surgeon's salve, the unguentum populian. So these were also known as sleeping ointments, surgeon's ointments. So this was kind of, more outside of the conversation around witchcraft, but more on the scientific side of it, and that he has a patient that is suffering from insomnia because her husband was cheating on her. And she was just in a very frenzied state. So he applies this soporific ointment to her that causes her to fall into a very deep sleep. And then when she wakes up, essentially, she's kind of pissed that the guy woke her up in the first place, and said that she was having a really good time and she was having sex with this really handsome young man, and, kind of called her husband out on what he was doing. And it's like, well, I just went and did this. So now I, feel way better about everything, and kind of like almost cured her in a way, or acted as a way for her to kind of get her revenge. So this ointment contained henbane, mandrake, deadly nightshade and hemlock, as well as an unspecified fat. But again, this is one of the earliest records of actually testing the ointment on a patient and listing its ingredients, as well as the sort of state that was induced and what the person actually experienced. There we go. The next recipe we have is from Della Porta in Natural Magic. It includes wild celery, which I think was probably hemlock. Again, the fat of children, the juice of parsley, aconite, cinquefoil, nightshade, and soot. So if you notice, the previous recipes were essentially kind of repeating that with maybe the addition of one or two other ingredients. The second recipe we have is water parsnip, which was probably aconite, calamus, which isn't necessarily psychoactive, but does have some entheogenic properties to it, cinquefoil, bat's blood, and nightshade. Then we go down to Reginald Scott in The Discovery of Witchcraft. So this would have been the most popular source on this topic written in English. It was very widely circulated and very influential. He mentions, again, the fat of young children, and seethe it with water in a brazen vessel. So he's essentially adding water to this fat, boiling it down, and reserving the thickest of that which remaineth in the bottom, which they lay up and keep until occasion serveth to use, adding Eleosalinum, which the sources cite as celery, again, probably hemlock, aconite, poplar buds, and soot. The second recipe mentions an herb called sium, which was water parsnip, but possibly aconite. So anytime I see mention of like parsnip, water parsnip, automatically my mind kind of goes to aconite or wolfsbane as being the actual kind of medicinal or chemically active entheogenic ingredient. Again, calamus, cinquefoil, belladonna, and oil. A lot of times we see, poison hemlock and aconite in addition to the nightshades being included in these recipes. So they would have also had a, a sedative and almost like paralytic quality. They would have also induced sensations of flight, movement through the air, in some cases, shape shifting, where it would give the person the sensation of having feathers or fur. They are used topically as pain relievers and work through stimulating the nerves to kind of distract the person from the pain that they're having. So this would have given people sensations of movement, coldness, changes in temperature that would have led them to believe under their altered state that they were flying through the air or transforming into animals. Now we start to see, look a little bit later, Carl Kiesewetter experimented with an ointment following one of Porta's recipes and reported flying in spirals. Then we have Will Eric Pukert, the early 19th century, a German folklorist that experimented with an effective dose of henbane, mandrake, and datura with two other individuals, and they reported having the same experiences. Later, he allowed a film crew to record him preparing this same recipe and then using it, but I've never been able to find any recording of this. He was also kind of like really ridiculed for doing this, and yeah, it didn't end end well for him. But it just shows that people have been investigating and experimenting with these ointments and reporting their experiences for a very long time, as well as having a lot of similarity in the experiences that they were having. Then I mentioned Robert Cochrane, also known as Roy Bowers, lived from 1931 to 1966. He was part of the early witchcraft revival, led a coven it's actually still in existence, run by other people, of course. But in a letter to his coven members, he's discussing the use of entheogenic herbs and fungi for their ritual uses. He says that the reason for going round the ring is strongly associated with the use of these plants and their quick dispersal throughout the body. So he's talking about people basically dancing and moving around the ritual circle to help with the absorption and effects of these plants coming into their bodies. He says that I recommend that myself should be the first to experiment with any new drug, and I would like to emphasize that these drugs are not habit-forming, although all of them are highly poisonous. And then he goes on to specifically mention a number of plants in the nightshade family. He also mentions fly agaric mushroom, and says that, however, once contact is made or successful flight, the need for these drugs is considerably diminished, since the technique can be learned by personal experience. So it's interesting that he was so open to the idea of experimenting with altered states of consciousness using entheogenic plants and fungi, where Gerald Gardner was pretty opposed to it and really kind of tried to distance himself and his religion from any kind of association to drugs and psychoactive plants and fungi. So after looking at the recipes and some of the accounts, we see that there are very similar ingredients with known psychoactive effects being used in these ointment recipes. They are soporific and somnitheogenic. So soporific meaning sleep-inducing, somnitheogenic being kind of a derivative of entheogenic, so accessing these altered states of consciousness through the sleep-inducing effects of the plants that are in these recipes. I also note that the medieval flying ointment accounts have very dramatic physical and psychic effects. So in any case where people are mentioned applying the ointments and there's an account of what happens next, they generally fall into a really deep sleep, and they have to be kind of violently woken from it because they sleep for such a long time. And they report these really dramatic kind of psychic experiences or visionary experiences of where they went and what they were doing while they were in this somnitheogenic state. So we did the Andre Laguna example of the woman whose husband was cheating on her, and her whole journey. There's another account where a woman applies the ointment, on her entire body, and then basically just kind of falls over into a really deep sleep, as well as another account where another person applies the ointment. They're also like sitting in a giant mixing bowl for some reason. And then when the ointment kicks in and starts to take effect, she falls off of the table, out of the mixing bowl, and it knocks her on the head. So very dramatic kind of physical effects when it comes to the accounts of these ointments. So we know that, something was actually happening. physically and chemically, that it wasn't necessarily just spiritual, magical, or visionary, but that there was a very like physical component to this. So we see that it induces sleep, madness in some cases, illusions of metamorphoses, light, feasting and sex, illusory visions, and also dreams of fields and gardens. So we see a lot of kind of common characteristics in the different accounts. They were used by witches, but could affect other individuals. So these would have been used to travel in spirit, to usually cause some kind of harm to somebody else. You know, we see a lot of these accusations of witches killing people's livestock, souring milk, um, you know, stealing other people's wealth, causing illness. Um, Another kind of contagion magic or poison magic. So it was used to affect other individuals as well as the person using them. So the main recurring theme is that plants in the nightshade family were the active components in flying ointments. Francis Bacon says that the medicines which go into the ointments are so strong that if they are used inwards, they would kill those that use them, and therefore they work potently, though outwards. So basically saying that if the plants were taken internally, they could cause death, but by using them topically, that they also have this very strong and profound effect. And we also have Porta commenting on the application of the ointment, stating that they rub all parts of their body exceedingly till they look red and are very hot, so the pores are opened and the flesh soluble and loose. They add either fat or oil, so the force of the ointment may pierce inwardly. So we've got kind of this external stimulation of rubbing all of the parts of the person's body to bring blood to the surface, to open the pores. And we know that this is a pretty vigorous and aggressive, like friction and rubbing until the skin is red and hot. So helping with the absorption that way. And then also using the medium of fat or oil so that the ointment will absorb inside. Gustav Schenk, a German toxicologist, noted that the solanaceae, or nightshades, since ancient times had been the true magical plants capable of causing states of consciousness otherwise unavailable to them. Michael Harner states that perhaps the single most important group of plants used by mankind to contact the supernatural belong to the order Solanaceae, or nightshade. The nightshade family is one of the largest and most important groups of plants on the planet. It occurs on all continents and in various climates. I think Antarctica would be the exception to that. So when should we use flying ointments? They're really pretty diverse magical formulas when it comes to their spiritual and ritual uses. So the very first one, of course, would be spirit flight. So astral travel, shamanic journeying, however we want to describe that. This could be through visualization, a trance state, or traveling in dreams. But spirit flight can kind of lead to, a lot of these other things. So more kind of specific intentions. So we've got initiatory experiences, whether that is going to the witch's Sabbath and having a transgressive spirit or transgressive experience with the folkloric devil. This could also be through connecting with another deity, associated with the plants that you're working with, or just kind of a deity of witchcraft and occult practice in general, or it could be an initiatory experience that is facilitated through the plant spirit that you're working with. It can also be employed to meet with and communicate with familiar spirits, and connecting with a specific current of energy. So because of their association to not only witchcraft, but magical practice in general, they really help to tap into sort of this energy of otherness. So that would be, specific current of energy. Um, Mentioned again, connecting with spirits and deities of witchcraft, and then seasonal rituals. So traditionally, Samhain, All Hallows Eve, Beltane, Walpurgisnacht. So we've got the two kind of gateways on opposite ends of the wheel of the year, one being Samhain, for connecting to the dead, and then the other side of the year, Beltane, which is very much connected to spirit flight and the wild hunt, but then also kind of the whole dark half of the year being a time where spirit flight was commonly believed to be practiced and be happening, connected to these older folkloric ideas of the wild hunt and spirits, gods, demons, witches, all sort of traveling through the nighttime sky. They can also be employed to connect with plant spirit familiars. So kind of opening the doorway and making that initial connection to a specific plant spirit through application of the flying ointment. Again, visionary meditation, shamanic journeying. So they're going to really help with visualization and kind of getting into an altered state or a trance state, to go on a specific type of journey, to gather some kind of information or have some type of a specific experience based on what your intention is for that particular journey. They can also inspire creativity, insight, and new perspectives. So essentially opening yourself up to the influence of the particular plant spirits, as well as all of the other spirits kind of connected to the story of the Witches Flying Ointment, to allow for these new insights to come through. Flying ointments can also be used for spell work. So they're very much just like anointing oils, with the exception that they have wax or fat added to them to make them thicker. So when we start to look at the individual ingredients and how they're combined, we can get an idea for a lot of other potential uses based on the plant's different magical correspondences. So the poisonous and psychoactive ingredients are not always the sole ingredients in flying ointment formulas. We see a lot of other non-psychoactive ingredients as well that can kind of bring out and enhance some of the other qualities of the entheogenic or psychoactive plants that are incorporated into them. So one thing that we see with working with the nightshades is that they not only exhibit these, very dark and sinister and Saturnian qualities, but they also have, Venusian, aphrodisiac, sexual qualities to them. They also exhibit mercurial qualities as far as traveling to different worlds, different levels of consciousness, and kind of that aspect of spirit communication. A lot of them have connection to the moon and the psychic realm. So including other ingredients into the formulas based on that and what your your specific intentions are. So they can be used essentially as anointing oils for spell work as well. And of course, they can be incorporated into divination practice. This could be to facilitate trance states, spirit communication, and channeling through altered states of consciousness, relaxing the mind, relaxing the body, allowing different things to come through in that way. But they can also be used for more specific divinatory practices. Um, they're really helpful for scrying, for third eye meditation to kind of get into a relaxed state of consciousness, open up the psychic senses through like anointing the temples, the third eye, the forehead. They can also be used to anoint the hands before drawing cards or throwing runes or bones or whatever different modalities that you're working with. So they can be used to enhance that as well. Underworld, travel, and necromantic workings. So because they are poisonous plants, they're very connected to the realm of the dead, the ancestors, and just kind of all of that hidden and chthonic knowledge that we associate with the underworld. So going there for healing, for soul retrieval, for spirit communication, to communicate with deities associated with the underworld. They can all be used for that. And then shape shifting. So a lot of the stories are connected to shape shifting, whether that is transforming into an animal spirit to, excuse me, access its power or its wisdom or that specific animal medicine that each animal has its different associations. So that's one way to work with shape shifting, to kind of take on the specific qualities associated with that animal. It can also be a form of spirit flight. So transforming into an animal spirit or a familiar spirit to then go out into the other world in another form, perhaps to blend in a certain way. So this would be like transforming into an animal associated with the underworld to better be able to navigate those different realms, to be able to move around unseen and unnoticed in realms that are not necessarily as hospitable or amicable towards humans. It could also be to transform into a flying animal to go to the upper world to connect with specific spirits, celestial, angelic, or different divine entities that are more connected to the upper world. So while they do have this underworld connection, spirit flight, there is also the option to travel to other worlds. It's not necessarily always underworld travel. Or shape-shifting into the fetch form, the astral double, and traveling that way. So how to apply flying ointments, where and when not to apply them, where and where not to apply them, and why. So the idea is increased absorption. So the use of oils that are going to be more easily absorbed, as well as the addition of other ingredients that are going to enhance that absorption. As we see in Porta's account, instructing the vigorous rubbing of the skin to bring blood to the surface, and working with the larger surface area. So there is the kind of the more magical, energetic use of these formulas as anointing oils that are going to be less dramatic as far as their physiological effects. So applying them to the third eye or the temples or to the wrists or to the heart area or more focused and specific areas of the body is going to be like a more magical, energetic use for it. So that is one way to kind of work with and connect to what the flying ointments are able to do within a ritual practice. But then when we start to talk about some of these more intense physiological experiences, the application is usually a little bit more dramatic. So really rubbing the skin, opening the skin. Another way to do that would be like take a ritual bath or take a shower beforehand. So the moisture and the heat from the water kind of opens everything up, which is going to help enhance the absorption. And also applying to a larger surface area. Um, so as anointing oils and just to kind of connect to the energy and use them more ritualistically, smaller areas of application are going to be effective. But when we're talking about more entheogenic use, applying to a larger surface area is going to really increase the absorption of the chemical components and give more dramatic results than just applying to a very small localized area. So of course, external use only, that's going to be very important. And that's something that we see kind of over and over again. Don't put them in your mouth or inside you in any other places because of the mucous membranes and the increased absorption in those areas. And yes, that is true. While it's going to be really difficult to poison yourself using any kind of topical preparation or topical application, the absorption is going to be increased in those areas, but also kind of taking that into consideration. If we're looking for increased absorption, we can go to those parts of the body that are more readily able to absorb those alkaloids. One of the safer areas is under the arms. So like your armpits, your underarms, applying there. Another place that I like to apply to is the soles of my feet. So I'll do that and then I'll put socks on. But again, the larger the surface area, the more absorption that you're going to get. Keeping in mind too that a lot of these plants in the nightshade family have been used topically as erotic massage oils, as well as internally for their aphrodisiac effects. So there would have been, some contact and some connection to these more sensitive areas. So people using them almost as like personal lubricant or erotic massage oils that wouldn't necessarily be put inside of you, but would have been applied to these more sensitive areas where the absorption is higher. So kind of using that at your own risk and just understanding that there are parts of the body that absorb a lot more quickly and more efficiently than others. And then, of course, their application as part of a larger ritual context. So you're going to get much more of an effective and useful experience working it into part of a larger ritual, versus just slapping the ointment on and then sitting there and waiting for something to happen or putting it on and then going to bed. So some kind of like setting the intention, having a specific reason for why you're using the ointment or kind of a specific goal in mind as far as the what's and whys, and that's going to give you a little bit more context to work with and also help with the spiritual aspect of making sense of the things that actually come through. So how are flying ointments made? They're actually pretty simple to make. So we're going to talk about that. The potential flying ointment ingredients. So there's really a lot of them. There's a lot of them that have entheogenic or psychoactive effects. A lot of them that don't, that are just kind of synergistic ingredients. But here are some of the different options that pop up in various recipes. Of course, plants in the nightshade family, henbane, deadly nightshade, datura, mandrake. We also see things like cinquefoil, yarrow, um, parsley, different things like that that are not psychoactive or entheogenic, but they are astringent. So when we start to look at some of the qualities of the non-psychoactive ingredients and why those may have been included, these high astringent herbs may have been added to the formulations to help with their absorption. Of course, we also see poppy, opium poppy, poplar buds, wormwood, mugwort, wolfsbane and hemlock, fly agaric or Amanita muscaria, and cannabis. There's a much longer list of potential flying ointment ingredients in the Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants by Christian Roch. But some of the main kind of ingredients being plants in the nightshade family, especially deadly nightshade or Atropa belladonna. This one is really awesome for underworld travel, any kind of spirit communication, especially its communication with spirits of the dead, chthonic or underworld spirits, and deities associated with witchcraft, including Hecate, the folkloric devil, Lilith is also another one that I like to connect with Deadly Nightshade. So a lot of really awesome magical correspondences that when we look at the sort of history and folklore of these plants that we can draw from as far as what spirits they're connected to and what different magical practices that they can be put towards. Black henbane is another one. We see black henbane a lot more, I guess, traditionally used as an incense. When it comes to like its magical uses, ritual magic, different fumigations, but it can also be used topically in the flying ointment recipe. Again, this one was used as an erotic massage oil, I believe in Germany, and I think they might maybe even still make it or did up until relatively recently, where not only does it have these relaxant and muscle relaxing and mentally relaxing kind of effects or lowering of inhibitions, but it's also got these aphrodisiac effects. So henbane does exhibit a lot of the both Venusian and Saturnian qualities that we see connected to these plants. It's also one of the ones that is most connected to the dead, the human dead, so spirit communication, necromancy, and all of those practices. Thornapple, datura. This is the latecomer, but we know that it does contain all of the same tropane alkaloids that we see in other members of the nightshade family that are chemically active or low dose. Of course, datura being used topically for pain relief, motion sickness patches, and different things like that. So we know that there is the potential for topical absorption working with datura in the flying ointment as well. Datura is probably one of the most diverse just because there are so many different varieties, each one with its own different mythological and folkloric connections, depending on the parts of the world that it's associated with. And it's also known as being a trickster and shapeshifter. So really, kind of unlimited potential when it comes to different things that we can connect datura to as far as the magical and ritual uses. So the science behind flying ointments. How do they work? Flying ointments work through a process known as inunction. This is the absorption of a small amount of phytochemicals through the skin over a period of time, so that they can have their effect without poisoning somebody. So that's why topical application is so much safer. That's why these are flying ointments and not flying beverages, because the way that the alkaloids are absorbed and the way that they affect us are much more dramatic when it comes to oral ingestion, drinking, eating, things like that. There is a question in the chat about fumigation. Fumigation being another type of ingestion, but still a little bit safer and a little bit different than eating or drinking. How do we use caution with fumigation in regards to taking too much? So that's the nice thing about that, is that you're typically only putting a small amount of incense or plant material onto a charcoal at each time. So it's not something that's being ingested all at once. So you can kind of gauge how you're feeling, what your experiences are, and go from there. Where with drinking something or eating something, like you're taking it all in larger amounts, and then there's really nothing that you can do to kind of stop that or slow things down. So with fumigation and smoking blends, you get almost a immediate response as far as like how you're feeling and how it's affecting you. So then you're able to stop before you take it too far. Yeah, so similar to topical application, and it's a slower or at least more controlled form of absorption. And again, like with henbane seeds, like I'm usually only putting like a pinch at a time onto the charcoal. And then also like if you start to experience any kind of like dry mouth, or like your throat gets really dry or your skin starts to get really flushed, that's when it's like a good idea to stop. So what can be expected with flying ointments? A sense of heaviness or sinking, sleepiness, so you feel drowsy, actual sedation, falling asleep, entering into dreamlike waking states. So it starts to kind of stimulate some of those deeper states of consciousness that we experience when we're asleep, but we can remain awake or kind of in an in-between state when working with flying ointments. You may notice arousal, again, having the aphrodisiac properties. There's also like what we see in the accounts, a very kind of sexual, seductive atmosphere when it comes to the different things that people are experiencing when under the influence of these formulas. And then, of course, changes in perception, the flow of time, the perception of light and shadow. That's one thing that makes these formulas so helpful for spirit communication and scrying, is because they really influence and affect how we perceive things, especially in relation to light. Um, we know they are mydriatic. They do dilate the pupils, so they're influencing how much light we're absorbing, um, essentially our sense of vision. So very effective for mirror scrying, smoke scrying, spirit communication, where we're actually visually perceiving these things. A little picture of the tropane alkaloids. And we notice that there's 3 different ones here, but they have almost exactly the same chemical structure. So while they're found in varying amounts in the different plants in the nightshade family, they're all going to have relatively similar effects when it comes to their medicinal and entheogenic qualities. So the basis for the ointment itself is just a simple herbal infusion. So probably something that a lot of people are already familiar with, essentially taking plant material and infusing it into some type of carrier oil. So with the flying ointments, the difference kind of comes in just understanding the mixing ratios to work with that are going to be, safe but also effective. So all of these flying ointment formulas do still maintain all of their medicinal effectiveness, working with therapeutic dosages. So they're going to be helpful for pain relief, muscle relaxation, all of the different medicinal uses, as well as the entheogenic effects. So if it is medicinally effective, it's going to be entheogenically effective. The mixing ratio that I typically work with all of the plants in the nightshade family that I do flying ointments with, so datura, henbane, and deadly nightshade, is a 1 to 10. I haven't used or haven't created a flying ointment with mandrake yet, um, but 1 to 10 kind of seems to be a safe spot for most people. You could push it to a 1 to 5, making it a little bit more concentrated, and then working with heat. So it's going to be really important that you do some type of a heat infusion when it comes to infusing the plants into the carrier oil. So just doing like a cold infusion where you're putting plant material into the oil and then letting it sit for 4 to 6 weeks and shaking it up every day is not going to extract the tropane alkaloids in the way that you need it to, because the tropane alkaloids are not readily oil soluble. So it's just like making magic brownies. Like there are certain things that you have to do to make it so that when you eat the brownies, that your body actually absorbs the THC and gets high off of it. Kind of the same idea with the tropane alkaloids. There's different things that need to be done to, make those able to be infused into the oil, and heat is going to be one of those things. So there's different ways that you can do that. You could do it in a crock pot. You could do it in the magic butter machine if you're, making larger amounts and wanting to get it done really quickly. Of course, you can also do the double boiler method. So there's lots of different ways that you can incorporate the heat, and hopefully to talk about that. You guys spent too much time on history. There is a question about the alcohol intermediary method before infusing the oils. And yes, that's definitely going to be beneficial when it comes to extraction. So the alcohol intermediary method is you're essentially taking high proof alcohol. I typically just do vodka. You can also do Everclear. I've also done it with rubbing alcohol, apple cider vinegar, to wet the plant material before you add the carrier oil. And this is going to help break down the cell wall and start that extraction process so that the chemical components are more easily extracted into the oil. So the alcohol acts as an intermediary, helping with that extraction process. Alcohol does it because it has a high pH and it's very like a volatile and effective solvent. But also on the other end of the spectrum, adding some kind of acidity to the formula is also going to help with extraction. So like I said, I've used apple cider vinegar before, and essentially just enough to like wet the plant material. So typically in modern herbalism, when we're making oil infusions, we're working with dry plant material. In this case, the tropane alkaloids are kind of locked into the cell wall of the plant. So using some type of intermediary to help coax it back out. So again, this can be high proof alcohol, rubbing alcohol, apple cider vinegar, which works through the acidity. You can also do red wine, which is a little bit more traditional. And again, it's just enough to wet the plant material down before you add the oil and then put it on the heat to help with the extraction process. Another thing that's going to be helpful is comminution, which is really powdering down the plant material that you're using before you add it to the oil. This is also going to make it easier to get a higher or more concentrated ratio. So if you're going from like 1 to 10 up to 1 to 5, which is going to be twice as concentrated, really powdering the plant material down so you can fit more of it into whatever amount of oil that it is that you're using. What else did I want to say about that? The powdering of the plant material is also going to help break through the cell wall and increase the surface area, which is another thing that helps with extraction or infusion into the oil. Just mention it really quick, and I'll mention it again. So acid is going to help with the extraction of any kind of plant alkaloid, not just tropane alkaloids, but alkaloids in general, because of the way that the pH affects them. So even, doing the alcohol intermediary method with vodka or Everclear, you can add apple cider vinegar to that, or you could also take citric acid and dissolve that into the alcohol, swish that around, and then use that to apply to your plant material before you add the oil. And we see it with Atropa belladonna is a lot of times, or was more commonly, I guess, up until recently, used more as a liniment. So it would have been kind of a combination of like a tincture and oil infusion. So again, we see that alcohol helps with the extraction and absorption. And then there is some differences between carrier oils. So some of them are going to extract the alkaloids a little bit more effectively than others. This is kind of a personal preference thing, like it's not going to make a huge difference, but some carrier oils do act a little bit differently than others. So more traditionally, it would have been more of a unprocessed olive oil or animal lard that would have been used for the infusion. So the unprocessed olive oil would have acted a little bit more like an acid when it comes to extraction. And then the animal lard would have been an option that would have been much more easily absorbed through the skin than a vegetable oil. Also got coconut oil. Coconut oil is going to be really good at extracting the chemical components as well. So pH is going to come into play not only in the oil infusion process, but also in the absorption. So when it comes to extracting tropane alkaloids from the plant material, a more acidic pH is going to be helpful for that. So like I said, things like vinegar, red wine, using citric acid, those are all going to help enhance your extraction process. Kind of the opposite is true when it comes to absorption. Using a more alkaline pH or things that are going to raise the pH are going to help with the transdermal absorption through the skin. So this is where the addition of soot that we see in a lot of the medieval recipes kind of has a more practical side to it. So adding soot or what I do is wood ashes raises the pH and helps with the absorption. So the wood ashes that I use are horticultural ash. It's kind of like a kind of fertilizer. but it's hardwood that's been turned into charcoal, and then I grind that up in a mortar and pestle, and then add just a little bit of that to the oil infusion, and then that helps to raise the pH, which enhances the absorption through the skin. There's other things that you can add to it too that enhance absorption. So things like ginger, um, chili powder, anything that has sort of, or cinnamon, anything that has like a natural heat to it. So like capsaicin um, is going to help increase blood flow, open the pores, increase the circulation, and facilitate absorption. So especially if you're making these for like pain relieving effects, adding some type of a warming spicy herb to it, like ginger, uh, peppers, cinnamon, is going to help with the deeper absorption into the tissue. Here's just some pictures of making it. So this is one of my flying ointment recipes. I did this one with pork lard. And again, pork lard is going to be, I guess, a little bit more traditional than working with some of the more modern processed vegetable oils. You also don't have to add wax to the pork lard since it's solid at room temperature. You definitely can to make it a little bit more thicker because it doesn't take much for it to liquefy. But that is going to extract tropane alkaloids a little bit more easily than some of the vegetable oils, and then it's also going to absorb into the skin a lot better. So if you compare an animal lard based ointment with a vegetable oil based ointment that has wax in it, and apply them in separate spots, you'll notice that the animal lard formula will absorb like 100%, where the vegetable based one just kind of sits on your skin. Um, and you're left with you're just greasy. But the pork lard absorbs completely. So that's where the addition of other, essential oils, astringent herbs, herbs that contain heat are going to help enhance the absorption if you're working with vegetable oils. Same thing with that alcohol intermediary method. This ointment I created is based on the earliest, the Cardano formula that I shared at the beginning. So we've got deadly nightshade, cinquefoil, parsley, and aconite. The aconite that I'm using is aconite root. The root has been prepared in the tradition for Chinese herbalism. So it's dried. A lot of the toxicity is kind of mitigated out through the preparation process. So they come in these little slices, and they're really, really hard. So what I did with these was soaked them in red wine overnight, and then I add the red wine to the rest of the formula that I infuse into the pork lard. You can also see the bottom left is a handful of the horticultural ash that I use to then raise the pH, which helps with the absorption. I did use fresh parsley in this recipe, which I guess is important to mention because I think that traditionally and historically, a lot of these ointments would have actually been made using fresh plant material, which is going to be a little bit different than working with dry plant material. So in modern clinical herbalism, it's always, you don't ever make an oil infusion using fresh plant material because it can go bad. It can get bacteria. It's not going to last as long. And while that is technically true, there is a little bit of exception to that. So with the nightshade plants in particular, having that kind of natural moisture and water still in there makes it a lot easier for the tropane alkaloids to come out because they're much more water soluble than they are oil soluble. They're also going to have a much higher potency in that state than they will in their dried state. So there is a chemical process that happens when a lot of these plants are, um, when they go from fresh to dry, that their alkaloid content is reduced considerably. Um, and this is good in some cases, especially like plants like wolfsbane or aconite. Using fresh versus dry is going to be vastly different, especially when it comes to working with the root where most of its alkaloid content is. But there is some benefit to working with the fresh plant material. But the parsley just reminded me of that. But in this case, I just used fresh parsley because it was what I got from the grocery store. But if we look at a lot of these recipes too, and I think kind of covered that in don't eat them and don't put them inside you. But if we go to some of these earlier recipes, just the way that they're worded. Mm, 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 mm. Okay, so we've got juice of parsley, aconite, cinquefoil, nightshade, and soot. So we could read that in a couple different ways. Are they just saying the juice of parsley, or are they saying juice of parsley, comma, aconite, cinquefoil, nightshade, and just writing juice one time? Um, and then we also see down here, seethe it with water in a brazen vessel, reserving the thickest of that which remaineth at the bottom. So is this kind of like a version of alcohol intermediary method where the water is actually being added to also help to extract the alkaloids from the plants? And then is it just being evaporated off, which then they're collecting the thicker remainder um, after the oil is already left? So I think that there's something that we can look at as far as playing around with using fresh plant material versus dried plant material when it comes to the effectiveness of the entheogenic effects. Um, of course, it's not necessarily going to last as long as something made with dried plant material, but also to kind of like contradict that. If you're doing the infusion with heat, essentially all of the water content and all of the moisture is getting evaporated out of it anyway, so it's not really there anymore to cause an issue after the fact. So I think just a little bit of a different train of thought when it comes to modern clinical herbal practices versus what people were doing in the Middle Ages. But we see a lot of this reference to the juice of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it is almost 12:30. I know that was a lot of information. It's usually like a 3 hour class that I made into an hour and a half class because there's really a lot that I can ramble on about and talk about depending on how interested people are and what different questions come up. So if anybody has any final questions, I'm happy to answer those. I've also got some notes that I'll repost to the Patreon for you guys, as well as the links to the recording afterwards. And also to anybody watching the recording in the future, if you have any questions or anything that I didn't touch on, feel free to shoot me an email at thepoisonersapothecary@gmail.com. Thank you, thank you. And then I will maybe see you guys at the next presentation at 1 o'clock.